Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Stringer again, and we are on to the last week of class, the very last topic, which is drugs, crime, and justice in the 21st century. So, for those of you that read the chapter already, this chapter is really kind of an overview of kind of the more recent policies and kind of what we're trying to look towards moving forward and possibly in the future for drug policy to kind of perhaps make some more effective choices. Without further ado, I will get right on into this. Um, there's been a little bit of a shift, especially when it comes to the current opioid issue, with a kind of a shift towards more of a public health approach with regard to that. And I think I talked about that at the very beginning of class, and so we've come kind of full circle all the way talking about that, the two different approaches and how we use the punitive approach for quite some time, and now how we're kind of shifting back towards more of a public health approach. And so I'll get into a little bit of that to kind of supplement what's in the book. And so there is substantial evidence that supports the notion that treatment programs work. Like I said before, the Martinson report was in the 70s, and that came out, and that kind of put kind of a damper on the public health approach for quite some time and led to the shift towards the more punitive approach. But remember, that was only just one report. And now that report is like 50 years old, and we have several other things that have come out since then. So it's helped to kind of progress things forward in a different direction. Um, and so they've really tried to focus a lot on supply reduction policies, such as interdiction, catching stuff at the border, reducing manufacturing, and disruption of the illegal drug supply routes. Now, obviously, a lot of this type of stuff will not work with things like meth, which people are cooking in their own kitchen. So, yeah, that's a different story, but that just applies to meth. Most of the other stuff, particularly cocaine and stuff like that, and the opium for the heroin is coming across the border from somewhere else. The marijuana can be grown here, obviously, and it is in some instances. And then the prescription pills are usually made domestically as well, unless you're getting some fake pills or something like that. And then those do come across the border some too, but not quite as much. Anyway, and then demand reduction strategies. Access to drug treatment programs. Some people will tell me, well, there's some people that they want to do drugs, and it doesn't matter if you have drug treatment programs for them. And there is some truth to that. Yes, there are some people that don't want to go into drug treatment programs, but there are a lot of people that do and don't have that option. So, you want to take, these couple of people that don't want to use drug treatment programs and generalize that to everyone and say we're not going to offer this at all. And I don't know that I'd agree with that. Focus on prevention of drug use, rehabilitative focus rather than the punitive focus, to try to help people to deal with their addiction, rather than just punish them until they stop using. And then harm reduction policies. And so we're going to talk about these. There's a really cool video that I put in D2L called Staying Alive on harm reduction, and it is actually from an injection site in Canada, where you can go to it. You have to bring your own drugs, but they will provide you with needles that are clean, and they have little booths, you'll see, and they have it set up. And you can inject your drugs there and use them, and then they have like an area to go to after you do it. Obviously this is a very controversial issue, and I don't think it would be very popular in the United States anytime soon. But essentially what it does is provides people a safe place to use the drugs to kind of reduce the harm from the heroin use, such as, STDs. Many different diseases are transmitted by using needles that aren't clean, and then the overdose issue. They have medical staff there that with the naloxone that can administer, that if someone were to overdose. So it reduces the overdose deaths as well. So it's an interesting thing to think about. We usually talk about it a lot in a face-to-face class. Unfortunately, we don't have really that format here. But I would encourage you all to watch that and think about that and think about, oh, could this be something? Is it a good idea, bad idea? Some people would probably say, well, it encourages drug use, stuff like that. I guess maybe, but I would venture to say that most of the people that go there would be people that would be using drugs anyway. That's kind of one of those issues that goes back and forth. Anyway, I won't ramble, or at least try not to. So treating drug-involved offenders. 95% of released state inmates with drug histories return to use within 3 years. 68% of drug offenders are rearrested. 47% are reconvicted. 25% are reincarcerated for a new crime. So recidivism for drugs is pretty high, right? So obtaining access to treatment programs can be difficult, especially for imprisoned drug offenders who abuse drugs, right? These programs are few and far between, and they're not usually funded very well. Part of that is because people don't want to pay for it. They don't want their tax dollars going to, fund people's, drug rehabilitation. We're fine with paying $30,000 a year to keep people in prison and punish them, but not for these what are seen as more soft on crime policies. And that gets into a little bit more of kind of this punitive sentiment that is kind of quite prolific within the American society, and how we don't want to be soft on crime and things like that. But I won't digress too much into that. Anyway, so one of the ways of treating drug cases and stuff is what is known as diversion. And so essentially what happens is if you're accepted into diversion, your case is kind of stopped. And what they do is, instead of proceeding with a trial and all of that stuff, you're diverted to this other treatment program. It varies from place to place and depending upon what kind of drugs you're using and stuff like that. But essentially what usually happens is, if you complete this program, then at the end of the program, maybe a year or two or whatever, then they'll dismiss the court case against you. And so this, is quite good at helping not only people to get treatment that they need for drug problems, but also to kind of prevent them from having some of those collateral consequences, like having a felony conviction that causes the job and the housing and all the other problems that go along with that. So it's usually for first-time offenders. If you've been through multiple times, you might not qualify for this sort of thing. And it began in the 70s. There's several programs that go throughout the country, and so it's a good alternative, I think, and it's one option that some places have implemented. And so moving forward, there is also what is known as jail treatment. And so, just like the name says, this is essentially where you would get some sort of drug treatment in jails. Jails typically do not have these sorts of treatment facilities available. And so, it would involve a brief screening, a referral to treatment, stuff like that. It's usually voluntary. If you don't want to do it, you won't have to, because it's a jail, unless there's some sort of sentence. If you've been sentenced by the judge and said you have to complete this while you're in jail. But generally that doesn't happen because, you're usually either sentenced to jail or you're sentenced to treatment. But there are some jurisdictions where that happens. Currently, I'm actually working with the Cobb County Sheriff's Office and the extension over in Marietta, and we're coordinating a new jail treatment program in the Cobb County jail for drug users. We're going to call it the Extension Inside. And so that's a new interesting thing that if anybody wants to know more about that or whatever, let me know. But essentially, we're going to be taking some of the treatment counselors um, from the extension to the jail to start a program there, and it'll hopefully help them. And then we're thinking that we might even be able to provide some aftercare for some of these people once they get released from jail, and they can go on over to the extension. Because as I've mentioned before, I think many people who go through drug treatment, they do great while they're in treatment, but then they get out. And then when they get out, they go back to whatever it was they were doing before, and that causes obviously issues. Anyway, and so we see that there are some results here that show that these things are effective and can kind of reduce drug use in the future. So obviously it's a good way. And the thing is too with the jail treatment program, I can tell you this because we've been working on this. People are already in jail, so to set up a treatment program for them is really not that expensive. You essentially just have to pay for the counselors to go there and kind of have these group sessions and stuff like that, because their room and board and everything else is already covered by the jail because they're going to be there anyway. And I think one of the key things to it, and we were setting up this program, is definitely good to make it voluntary, so that people that want treatment can have it, but it's not you're not forcing people to go. Because when people are there and they don't want to be, that can really mess up the dynamics of things. You've probably been in classes where there were people, maybe other students who were there that they didn't want to be and they didn't have the best attitude about it. So to kind of help you all relate to how that might go. Anyway, you might even have a professor that didn't want to be there. I don't know. Anyway. And so it's important to continue that treatment after release, like I said. But anyway, so treatment in prison, this has been going on for a little bit longer. Obviously people are in prisons for longer. They're already sentenced, so you know how long they're going to be there. In prisons tend to have a little bit more resources available than jails. Jails have a very high turnover because most people there aren't even sentenced yet. The people that are there aren't sentenced for very long, because if you get over 12 months, then you go to prison. So there are much more opportunities in prison. Let's just put it that way. They've come out with these new things called therapeutic communities. I know when I lived back in Virginia, we worked with one called the Indian Creek Correctional Center, where the whole prison was a therapeutic community for drug offenders. It was really cool. And so you had all drug offenders. And so that really helps to kind of be able to focus everything on this one type of offender, right? Versus having, the drug offenders and you have the same prison with the maximum security, and obviously drug offenders don't usually go to maximum security unless they've got something else that they've done other than just the drug offense, or they've got escape attempts. But anyway, so long story short, there's about 15 years of research that show that these things are effective and can reduce recidivism and relapse, especially when coupled with aftercare. And aftercare is caring for the person, helping them after they get out, after they get out of therapy, after they get out of treatment, after they get out of prison, after they get out of the extension, after they get out of jail. Because can't tell you all this enough. People do great when they're in treatment, and then they go out, they get out, and then they go right back. It's like a vicious cycle. I've seen it time and time again. Anyway, so prison treatment centers, therapeutic communities can usually contain an aftercare component, but the compliance with it can be problematic, especially since once people are outside of the prison, they're then turned over to community corrections, which is a different entity, so to speak. Probation and parole is separate from the prison. They don't really interact very much. MTCs in federal prisons, a positive effect. 6 months post-release, relapse decreased by 73%, and alcohol and drug use reduced by 44%. So that's by Peleser and colleagues. Yeah, sorry, I don't know that person. Anyway, treatment under community corrections supervision. So this is essentially where maybe you're you're convicted of a first offense, drug offense, and instead of being sentenced to prison, you'll be sentenced to jail you're sentenced to probation. And the condition of your probation is that you have to complete some sort of treatment, so it's a drug treatment, right? Um, this can apply to parolees too, but it's more often seen with probationers. And so, you know, don't know that I have a whole lot to add about this. I'm trying to look through here and think. One of the things too with this is when you assign people to treatment, it can kind of mess things up with your study if you're looking at people that are assigned to treatment, because the people assigned to treatment will often get drug tests. And if you're giving people drug tests, you're going to have more people testing positive for drugs versus if you have people that aren't on drug tests. And so that can tend to skew some of the results sometimes with some of these studies. But by and large, they tend to, be positive. I like to talk about sometimes how there's a large number of parolees in need of drug treatment who aren't receiving it. And that applies not only to parolees, but people that are incarcerated, people that are in jail and prison, and that haven't even gone to court yet, and just in general society. There's tons of people out there that aren't involved in the criminal justice system who are in need of drug treatment and aren't receiving it. And I've said before that most of them are not receiving it because they can't afford it. And I'll acknowledge there are some people that don't want it too, of course. So there's that too. So I'll just move on behind here because this is just talking about the results of some different studies. Male parolees, 25% received treatment after release, so it's a pretty low amount. Like I said, that's an important aspect of things, so you want to keep it there. Then we'll move on to drug courts. Drug courts were established first by Janet Reno in Dade County. I've got a couple of videos in D2L on drug courts. If you're interested in learning a little bit about kind of how they operate, like I said, if we were in class, we could talk about this, probably watch those videos in class, but you can still do so at home in your comfort of your living room. One of those videos is by Matthew Perry, who was Chandler in Friends. He also played in a couple of other movies. There was one with Selma Hayek where I can't remember the name of that movie. But anyway, and essentially he had a big substance abuse problem, and he talks about how drug courts really kind of saved his life, so to speak. So drug courts are much different than a regular court. We have a drug court here in Cobb County, which I do a little bit of work with sometimes, and we just did something with evaluating the drug offenders, which we haven't got the results in yet for. But anyway, so essentially, usually when you go to court, you have kind of the defense side and the prosecution side, and it's kind of an adversarial system, right? Well, in the drug court model, it kind of tries to take the adversarial system away so that everybody's kind of collaborating and working together. And what will happen is if you're sentenced to drug court, first you have to qualify for drug court. And again, these are usually first-time offenders. You might be able to get in as a second-time offender. Usually nonviolent offenders. They're not going to take anybody that's violent and deal with that. You're going off to prison somewhere. And those sorts of things. And so what essentially will happen is you usually have a treatment requirement. So you're going to have, your treatment, and you're usually in community corrections supervision. So you're on probation. You'll have a treatment component as a condition of that. The big part of it is rather than going and reporting to a probation officer, you go and report to the judge once a month. And so that tends to have a little bit of an effect on people, having to go and stand before the judge and talk about what they've been doing or not doing. And the judges give them certificates and stuff when they do well, but also the judges hand out punishments when they don't do so well. So if you say you failed a drug test, you might be sentenced to 7 days in jail or something like that. And you might have to go to jail for 7 days, or maybe the weekend or something like that. And one of the ways that this works too is not by, say, if you fail a drug test under a traditional probation model, they would have kind of one option or a couple of options would be kind of limited, which would be, well, we can either violate you and send you back to court, in which case you go and you serve the rest of your suspended sentence, or we can kind of do nothing about it. There's really not a whole lot of wiggle room in there. But in the drug court model, they can do a variety of things that are what is known as an intermediate sanction, which is kind of in between sending you to prison or jail and kind of doing nothing. So there's middle stuff in there, such as making you spend the weekend in jail or making you do more community service and things like that. And they can do this immediately. They can have them take you away instead of saying, okay, we're going to violate you and do all this other stuff. So there's that kind of urgent or immediate punishment to say, well, I can go and smoke this joint, but I know I'm going to go before the judge next week, and then he's going to put me in jail for the rest of the weekend. So is it really worth it, right? And drug courts have shown to be pretty successful. They have started actually implementing different types of courts, specialty courts based on the drug court model. A big one that I'm familiar with is the DUI courts. They've also started, I think, veterans courts and some other types of courts, based upon this whole drug court model. And at some point, some people are like, should we have a specialty court for every little type of offense or what? So that is one kind of criticism of having these specialty courts. It's been very successful with drugs and drunk driving. I'm not as familiar with the other types of specialty courts, though. So. But anyway, its usually effectiveness is measured by recidivism rates, whether crime is reduced, and of course the cost effectiveness. And drug courts are usually pretty cost effective, mainly because they don't use taxpayer money to pay for them. They require the offender to pay for them. And so that doesn't create any burden for the taxpayers, which most people like, except for the offenders who have to pay for it. But anyway, so the National Drug Court Institute's National Research Advisory Committee has three kind of primary performance measures. Retention, so they want you to complete the drug court. They don't want you to just stay. There are some people that, they don't make it through the whole thing. They drop out after a little while. Some people say that it's actually more work, and they drop out because they just say, you know what, I'd rather just go and spend my 6 months and sit in jail and do nothing than have to do all of this stuff. Because, like I said, you have to keep a full-time job, and you have to be able to pay for all of your drug tests and all the treatment and everything, and then you're often going to have to go to NA or AA meetings a couple times a week. You got to meet with probably your PO. You got to meet with the judge. You got to, you got a lot of stuff to do. You're very busy. If you go to jail, you just sit there and do nothing all the time. So some people would opt for that. And so that's why it's important to tell them, know what they're getting themselves into. Sobriety, obviously, they use drug tests a lot to make sure that you're not using drugs. It's one of the big conditions of the drug court. And then recidivism. They don't want you getting any new arrests while you're in drug court as well as afterwards. So those are one of the measures of success. Looking at the Baltimore Drug Treatment Court, Gottfredson and some others, looked at this, and they found that it did reduce drug offender or drug use and recidivism. And so this was a meta-analysis, which for those of you that don't know, is really cool because it brings in all of the results from very different and separate studies. One of the cool things about this from Portland, Oregon, is they said they saved about $1.5 million per year per 300-person caseload. So, that's substantial money savings there. If we can't get people on board with, drug treatment, I like to usually say, well, you like money, right? And you like saving it? Well, there's something there, right? So let's think about that. Let's think about ways to save money. And then we can take this money and put it into something else. Anyway, medication-assisted treatment programs, this is very popular, especially when it comes to opioid addiction. You've probably heard of methadone. which is kind of the synthetic opioid that's similar to morphine. There's a couple other derivatives out there that they use for this, but essentially you take this every day and it helps you not to have the withdrawal symptoms of the opioid addiction. Um, they don't really do this with other types of drugs because they don't have a severe withdrawal and you don't really need the medicated assistance treatment. Alcohol, they might do it initially when you're in detox. They might give you some different stuff to help you deal with the detox from alcohol when you're in detox. But then once you move on to treatment, you don't really get that stuff anymore either. It's really just for the opioids. And the idea is to try to get you off of this stuff. I think I mentioned earlier in the class that they developed heroin to get people off of morphine, and because people are getting addicted to morphine, so they developed heroin. And then now we have methadone that they developed to try to get people off of uh, the heroin. So, uh, I wonder what we'll have next to get people off of the methadone. But it's not supposed to get you high. So it helps you with the withdrawals, but it doesn't give you the high. Um, anyway, so Proposition 36 in California, this was something that they passed to create a policy that the drug courts, try to use this medicated medicated assisted treatment. Sorry. So the program was deemed to be effective for nonviolent first and second time drug offenders. And it was a community-based treatment program, obviously, but only about 0.2% of people actually got it. Um, and of course, the National Association for Drug Court Professionals unanimously passed a resolution in support of doing this, especially with regard to opioid addiction. That can be very helpful. Anyway, so modifying mandatory minimum policies. As we talked about with sentencing, there's been a lot of crazy sentencing policies. They've done a little bit with trying to fix a lot of those. Your textbook goes into some detail about that. The Drug Reform Act in New York, some federal reforms, stuff like that. Remember, I think I talked about the 100 to 1 crack ratio. So it was 100 to 1. So if you got an ounce of cocaine versus an ounce of crack, you would get 100 times longer sentence for the crack than you would for the cocaine. They've actually reduced that now, so it's not 100 to 1, but it's still like 10 to 1, as you probably saw when you were working through that sentencing worksheet the other day. And so some issues with new approaches. New York judge says nearly all nonviolent drug offenders should be sentenced to treatment instead of jail time. That makes sense. And then if the treatment doesn't work, then maybe, well, okay, fine, we'll see if we can, if that doesn't work a few times, then maybe we'll try something different. Anyway, since 2000, New York State prison system population has declined from 71,000 to 54,000, attributed to both a decrease in felony arrests as well as the expansion of diversion programs for drug offenders. So drug offenders is being sent to diversion instead of being sent to prison. Again, saves lots of money. And then we look at Arizona Drug Medicalization Prevention and Control Act. Legal drug users be sentenced to mandatory treatment, education, or community service instead of prison. And you see some other similar laws in California. Community-based drug treatment under probation instead of prison. So there's kind of a theme here with this sort of thing. And you think about it, you don't want to sentence a murderer or a rapist to community supervision. It's probably safer that they might be locked up in the prison for the safety of society, right? We don't want them murdering other people. But for drug offenders, the worst thing they're going to do is go use drugs again, which only really hurts themselves. I guess that's not the worst thing they might do. They might go steal stuff to further their habit. I guess that is possible, right? So the worst thing is they'll go steal something, and then of course they can be rearrested for that. So I mean that's things to think about. Um, and again, like I said, that's pretty rare anyway, though. Especially if they're maintaining employment and having drug tests, then they won't be getting addicted because they won't be using the drugs and they'll have a job, so they won't need to steal. Uh, so, the debate over decriminalization and legalization. This is always an interesting topic that usually takes like a week or so to talk about in class. Um, and I'll try to just kind of hit the high points here, and since we're not all in the same place to discuss it. Um, Anyway, so obviously legalization would significantly reduce the costs of drug use. So anti-drug laws target specific drugs such as tobacco and alcohol. Um, Legal drugs, um, although they might be more harmful. In recent years, they've come to realize the harm of tobacco, but years ago it was like, oh, everybody smoked. Um, and the current laws kind of have a negative impact on public health, right? Um, so that's something to think about. Decriminalization is a little bit different. So decriminalization isn't quite legalization, and some people think that that is, but it's not. So criminalized drugs, it means that it's a crime to possess drugs, right? And then you have legalization on the opposite spectrum, where it's just perfectly legal and you can walk down the street smoking a joint. And then you have kind of in the middle, where if you get caught smoking a joint, you might get a ticket and you might have to pay a fine or something like that. But you're not going to go to jail and you're not going to get, a whole criminal charge or be convicted of a felony and stuff like that. So that's what kind of decriminalization is. And I think it's a little bit easier to get people on board with that than it is full legalization. But just to kind of talk about that, right? Some potential benefits and problems with this. Um, Lower drug prices. If things are decriminalized, or especially if they're legalized drugs will be way cheaper because the supply will go up. And so, but that can also lead to a decrease in crime because of all the crime and the systemic violence that's related to these illegal drug markets, right? And so some of like over in the Netherlands and Amsterdam, Portugal, those areas. Well, Portugal's not. Anyway, Portugal's South America. But anyway, so in Portugal they decriminalized all illegal drugs for personal possession. They're just like you can possess whatever you want. We don't care. So Eric Good talks about this kind of hassle effect that there's kind of this difficulty to obtain illegal drugs, right? That is kind of effective at reducing some drug use because if it was easier to buy, like alcohol is used way more than other drugs are because it's easier to get alcohol when you're above 21. Now, when you're under 21, it's actually harder. I think it's harder to get alcohol than it is to get other drugs because of the age limit issue. But anyway, so that hassle effect might reduce some drug use. Some people say that the harms of legalization would outweigh the benefits, and that kind of permitting hard drugs is a dangerous experiment, that more people will use drugs if, they're legal. That's possible that more people might use them. Does that necessarily mean it's a harm if more people smoke weed than do today? I don't know. I find it hard to believe that would be necessarily a harm. I guess unless you think it's harmful in and of itself that people smoke weed. But anyway, and then some people say that marijuana is not as innocuous as believed. That it can cause some respiratory damage, and there's some side effects on the adolescent brain. There is some research that shows that smoking marijuana when you're very young, young teenagers, 13, 14, that can have some effect on the brain because the brain is still developing at that age. And that's why even the states that have legalized marijuana, they still have an age limit. It's like alcohol. You can't legally use it when you're a kid. And then, it can cause respiratory damage, just like smoking cigarettes, right? If you're smoking something all the time, smoke is not good for the lungs, so to speak. And then there's kind of the prescription and maintenance models. We've kind of talked about the heroin maintenance clinics in Canada, where the addicts can come and receive, health and social services and be observed while they're using. They have these in Switzerland as well. Um, if you think about it, I can kind of like this part that drug use is kind of a medical and a public health issue, and it used to be so up until early 1900s. And it's not really a criminal justice matter, but it has been treated as such. It's kind of like mental health, right? Mental health is not really a criminal justice matter, but because we don't have other people to deal with it, it kind of becomes a criminal justice matter, and then the police have to deal with it, and they're not really that good at dealing with that thing, mental health. Anyway, decriminalizing and legalizing marijuana. As looking at this, 72% of people believe that governmental efforts to reduce marijuana cost more than they're worth. So essentially, it's just costing us a bunch of money, and we should just kind of let it go. And 60% stated that federal government should not enforce federal laws in states that allow marijuana use. Because remember, even the states that have legalized marijuana, it's still illegal under federal law. And I think I talked about previously that it used to be when California established these dispensaries, the DEA was going and raiding these dispensaries and stuff when Bush was in office. And then when President Obama took over, he said, we're not going to deal with that. We're not going to do that. And I have a paper where I quote President Obama, and he says, we have bigger fish to fry than marijuana users in California. So anyway, medical marijuana. Medical marijuana has gotten to where it's legal in quite a few states now. It really kind of took off in the 90s. Before that, there was not a whole lot of medical use. And remember, it's still in Schedule 1 for the drug schedules for the federal government. The feds still say there's no medical use for it, even though we found that, it's being prescribed in many states, especially for cancer patients and seizures and other things like that. And so it's quite prolific for medical use. And it was, like I said earlier in the class, it was used for thousands of years as a medicine until the early 1900s when they said we need to stop using it. Anyway, so looking at this, decriminalization includes some fines and penalties instead of criminal charges. Legalization essentially is what it's called, right? It's just legal. It's like anything else. And then Oregon was the first state to decriminalize possession of marijuana in 1973, for those of you that did not know. And I think, as I remember, I think Utah just passed something decriminalizing all drugs, as I recall. But don't quote me on that, but maybe look it up if you're interested. But anyway, so state statutes that have different guidelines that determine what will or will not be legal. There are a few of those. There's some possession amounts permitted, like in some states you can possess up to an ounce, but anything more than an ounce of marijuana, is illegal. If you're from, and you can only purchase such an amount in some of these states, especially if you're from out of state. Like if you're a resident of, I don't know, maybe like, what's a state that's near? Like maybe you're a Kansas resident and you go to Colorado where it's legal. You can only purchase like up to a half an ounce or something like that because they don't want people going to Colorado and buying it and then taking it across state lines. Because if it goes across state lines, then they're worried that might actually attract the attention of the federal government by going across state lines. So Colorado and Washington in 2012 were the first states to legalize marijuana for recreational use. Before that, it was just legal in some states for medical use, right? And in California, it was supposed to be for medical use, but it wasn't that hard to get the prescription. And if you had glaucoma or something, they would give it to you. Oh, well, yeah, you need this for anxiety. Um, so it was kind of justified that way. And then the first dispensaries opened in Colorado in 2014. And I don't know if I've told you all, but they had a real problem trying to figure out what to do with the money. They had so much money in Colorado coming in from all of these marijuana sales from these dispensaries, and the state government was like, we can't. They didn't know what to do with it because they couldn't put it in the bank because the banks are federally insured by the federal government, right? And so they couldn't put it in there because it was illegal under federal law. And so what they ended up doing is having these giant safes with counting rooms and everything. And what they did was is they talked to people from Nevada because people in Nevada run the casinos, and so they're very, well versed in dealing with money that they can't do a lot with. And so what they ended up doing was putting it all in these vaults and safes and whatnot, and then spending it on their own expenses directly versus putting it in the bank and spending it that way because they didn't know what to do with it. And so that was an interesting thing. Some of the people I talked to when they implemented this were saying that it was kind of a challenge because they passed the law and then they started doing it so quickly that they were kind of like building the airplane as they were flying it. And obviously the other states that have followed since then kind of have been able to weed out a few of these issues before they got to them by talking to Colorado and Washington about how they did it. So this is just a current map for those of you that are kind of curious of the number of states that have legal marijuana use. So the green ones, green is a good color choice, right, are legal for recreational use. And then these lighter greens, that's a green too, huh, is legal for medical use only. And then these other areas say that there's no program for legal THC. And you see this mostly in the South and Texas. And I got a few over here. And then Wisconsin up there all by itself, which is interesting. So, yeah. And interestingly, in Georgia, you can have the CBD oil, but not marijuana. And some of you might have heard last year, the year before, but they had to stop all the marijuana prosecutions in the state because once they legalized CBD oil, the labs didn't have any way to tell the difference when they tested the CBD oil versus testing marijuana to test the difference between the two. And so they stopped prosecuting marijuana offenses. And there's a video, I think from like Gwinnett County, it made it into the news where the cops actually gave the person their marijuana back. And they're like, yeah, we can't prosecute this. And they gave it back to them. That was the only case I ever heard of them giving it back to them because they can still take it and seize it. But I thought that was interesting. But anyway, so I'll try not to talk for too long about all of this. But so moving on and thinking about reimagining and creating new approaches to drugs. The Obama National Drug Control Policy based on kind of a third way of doing things. That didn't say we're going to use completely public health, and we didn't say that we're going to completely just use this kind of punitive criminal justice approach, but kind of balancing the two and kind of using both of them, which, doesn't sound like a bad idea, right? And it does kind of base it on the knowledge that drug addiction is a brain disease, right? And so looking at, Public Safety Realignment Act, this is fueled by California's concern with prison overcrowding. Prison overcrowding was a really big problem in California, more so than other states for quite some time, and that's a whole separate issue that we could get into later. If you have questions about that, please let me know. But it started with the privatization and the direct democracy and different stuff. Anyway, but so they started saying, well, non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenders are ineligible for state prison sentences. Like if they don't fit these criteria, they're not even eligible to go to prison. You can't send them. We're not taking them. And so then they would be transferred to counties for supervision and treatment. And so no, we're just not taking them. We're too full. So anyway, I don't know if I've told you all about this civil asset forfeiture program, but they've talked about revising that. And essentially, what happens is if you're suspected of selling drugs, they can seize your property, take your cars and money and all this other stuff. And it's a civil asset forfeiture, so it's not criminal. So they don't have to prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They just have to prove that it's more likely than not that you were using this house or a car or whatever to use or to sell drugs. So the burden of proof is much lower. They've actually had people that got acquitted in criminal court but still had their stuff taken away. And obviously, this money goes to fund the police departments and things like that. And so there's been some discussion about revising that. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. But we really need more research before America decides to legalize all the drugs to see kind of what the potential negative consequences could be. We're seeing kind of some natural experiments go on with marijuana in many states nowadays. And, as this continues to grow, we'll monitor it and see what happens. Um, I don't know that I would advocate for trying to generalize what's happening with legalizing marijuana to legalizing other drugs, though. You know, as I've said before, marijuana is not a very dangerous drug. No one's overdosed from it, and people don't tend to get very violent or anything when they use marijuana. But when it comes to other drugs, there's much more likelihood of overdosing. Some drugs make people much more violent, and so those things could be a bigger concern than just the effects of marijuana, where you don't have to worry about it. I'll kind of end on that note with some kind of food for thought for you all. And this is the last class, or the last lecture. So I hope you all enjoyed the class. And this is a special topics course, so please do your course evaluations because if you all don't tell everybody how you like this class, we won't be offering it anymore. So if you enjoyed it, please let me know. And this is the first time I've taught this class online, so it's a little bit different. And I apologize that we haven't had the same interaction that we would have if we had a face-to-face class. Um, as you probably can tell, I could talk about all this stuff for quite some time. But anyway, so with that, I hope you all have good luck on your final exam. And please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. And I hope you have good luck in the rest of your endeavors and the rest of your classes here at KSU. And with that, I will sign off for the last time and say adieu.